to chaos. Secrets buried in the city's forgotten corners begin to surface, revealing a world of dark magic, forgotten rituals, and gods who once ruled over the land. But with power comes danger, ancient forces are stirring, and the city itself may be on the brink of destruction. As Ao and his friends navigate the twisting maze of their own destinies, they must confront the terrifying truths about the gods' return. But can they stop the gods from reclaiming their lost kingdom? Or will they become pawns in a game far bigger than themselves? Join us for an unforgettable journey into a world where magic and myth collide, and the price of survival is higher than ever. Don't miss out on the dark twists and shocking secrets waiting in every episode. In the heart of Angola, a vibrant African city where the new and old blended seamlessly, Ao worked at his family's market stall. The bustling crowds, colorful fabrics, and rhythmic music made every day feel alive. Yet, lately, something had changed in the air. It felt heavier, more charged, as if the city was holding its breath. It all began one afternoon when a strange old woman appeared at their stall. She wore a simple brown cloak, but her eyes seemed to hold ancient secrets. As Ao handed her a basket of fruits, she grasped his hand firmly, her fingers cold as stone. A sharp jolt of energy surged through him. "You are marked," she whispered in a language Ao barely understood. Her voice was rough, like wind blowing through dry leaves. "They will come for you soon." Ao's heart pounded. "Who will come?" "The forgotten gods," the old woman said, leaning closer. "They never truly left, but they have been waiting for someone like you." Before Ao could react, the woman vanished into the crowd, leaving behind only the lingering coldness of her touch. His hands trembled as he stood frozen in place. What did she mean by marked? And why had she spoken to him? Ao tried to shake off the encounter, but all afternoon, he felt strange. His surroundings seemed off, as though shadows moved on their own, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. That night, sleep didn't come easily. His dreams were filled with unsettling images, ancient temples, dark forests, and a faint but ever-present chant that echoed in his mind. In the distance, he saw a figure standing on a hill, watching him. Ao woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. Something was happening, something he could not yet explain. Ao spent the next few days trying to forget the old woman's words, but the feeling of unease stayed with him. He didn't mention the encounter to anyone, not even his family. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. It started with the animals in the market. Birds that once happily chirped near the stalls now stayed away when Ao was near. Stray dogs barked at him without reason, and he noticed their fearful eyes tracking him as he walked past. Then came the dreams, every night the same dream of the dark figure standing on the hill. Each time, the figure grew closer. One morning, as Ao washed his face, he saw something different in the mirror. A small, dark symbol had appeared on the back of his left hand. It wasn't a cut or bruise, it was something else, something ancient. The mark was shaped like a spiral, surrounded by symbols he didn't recognize. Ao's chest tightened. He scrubbed at the mark with soap and water, but it wouldn't fade. Panicked, he wrapped a cloth around his hand and went about his day, trying to ignore the throbbing sensation that had begun in his palm. The whispers returned that afternoon. As Ao walked through the market, the sounds of the crowd seemed to fade, replaced by low murmurs that only he could hear. They grew louder with every step, like invisible voices whispering directly into his ears. Ao. He spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Sweat dripped down his neck as the whispers continued, growing more insistent. Ao, they are watching. The shadows seemed to stretch out, pulling towards him as if alive. He felt their presence, cold and hungry. Ao turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever was happening, he knew one thing: the woman's warning had not been a coincidence. Something was after him. Determined to understand what was happening to him, Eo sought out the oldest man in the city, Baba Tand, a well-respected elder known for his knowledge of Ngola's forgotten history. Baba Tand's house sat on the edge of the city, far from the noise of the streets, surrounded by thick baobab trees that were said to be older than the city itself. Eo knocked on the wooden door, his heart pounding. After a moment, Baba Tand opened it. He was small and frail, with skin as wrinkled as old leather, but his eyes were sharp and bright. "Come in, boy," Baba Tand said, his voice strong despite his age. "I've been expecting you." Eo hesitated, then stepped inside. How could Baba Tand have known he was coming? They sat together in the dimly lit room, and Eo told him everything, the strange woman, the mark on his hand, and the whispers that had been following him. Baba Tand listened silently, his face unreadable. When Eo finished, the old man sighed deeply. "The forgotten gods," he said softly. "They were once worshipped in this land, long before the new gods arrived. They ruled the skies, the earth, and the underworld. But as people stopped believing, they faded into the shadows." Baba Tand leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "But they never left. They are always waiting for someone with the mark." Eo's blood ran cold. "What does that mean for me?" "It means they have chosen you," Baba Tand said. "You are connected to them now. They will use you to return to this world." Eo stood abruptly, his chest tightening with fear. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for this." Baba Tand shook his head sadly. "It doesn't matter what you want, boy. The gods have chosen, and they do not ask for permission." The sun was setting over Angola, casting long shadows over the city as Eo made his way back home. Baba Tand's words weighed heavily on his mind. Chosen by the gods. What did that even mean? And why him? As Eo approached his house, he felt it again, the cold presence. The whispers had returned, faint but unmistakable. He hurried inside, locking the door behind him, but the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, the room seemed darker, as if the shadows were closing in around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt a sharp pain in his hand, the mark was burning. Eo stumbled backward, his breath coming in gasps. The air grew thick with energy, and then he saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, cloaked in darkness. They circled him, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing faintly with a sinister light. Without warning, they began to chant in a language Eo couldn't understand, their voices low and menacing. The mark on his hand burned hotter, and he cried out in pain, clutching it tightly. The figures raised their arms, then the room grew colder. Eo could feel the energy building, swirling around him like a storm. His mind raced, what was happening? Were they performing some kind of ritual? One of the figures stepped forward, holding a small animal, the bird, its wings trembling. In a swift motion, the figure brought the bird to the mark on Eo's hand. The bird's feathers turned black as they touched his skin, and a faint glow surrounded it. Eo felt the power flowing into him, dark and terrible. The chant grew louder, the shadows twisting and writhing around them. The bird gave a final cry before falling silent, its body vanishing into the darkness. Eo gasped, his head spinning. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures were gone. The room was silent, but the energy still pulsed in the air. The mark on Eo's hand continued to glow faintly, but the pain had subsided. His breath was shaky, his heart still racing from the intensity of the ritual he had just witnessed. The mark on his hand no longer looked like just a simple spiral, it now seemed to pulse with its own life, as if it had absorbed the energy from the ritual. He collapsed onto the floor, struggling to understand what had just happened. What kind of power had the forgotten gods just given him? And why did it feel both terrifying and strangely familiar? The old woman's words echoed in his mind, they never truly left, but they have been waiting. Eo could no longer deny it. The gods, these ancient, dark gods, were real, and they had chosen him for something far greater than he could comprehend. But why? What did they want from him? The next morning, Eo woke to the sound of pounding on his front door. His mind was foggy from the previous night's events, and for a moment he wasn't sure if it had all been a dream. But the burning sensation in his hand told him otherwise. Eo, are you there? It was his friend Kofi, the one person he had known since childhood. Eo staggered to the door and opened it. Kofi, tall and thin, his dreadlocks falling over his eyes, stood outside, looking concerned. You didn't show up at the market this morning, Kofi said, peering at Eo's pale face. What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. Eo glanced at his hand, then back at Kofi. Should he tell him? Could Kofi even understand what had happened? How could he explain that ancient gods had marked him, that dark forces were now stirring, and he was at the center of it all? I just didn't feel well, Eo stammered. Rough night. Kofi raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Well, you should rest then. But there's something going on in the city you should know about. People are talking about strange things, people going missing, animals acting weird. Eo's heart skipped a beat. Could it be connected to the gods? Were these disappearances related to what was happening to him? They say there's some kind of cult in the city, Kofi continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. People are scared. Something dark is coming, Eo. The word cult sent chills down Eo's spine. He had to find out more about these disappearances, and he had to understand the connection between them and the forgotten gods. But first, he needed answers, real answers. I need to talk to Babatand again, Eo muttered, more to himself than to Kofi. Kofi looked confused. The old man? Why? What does he have to do with this? Eo shook his head. It's complicated. But I have to go. I'll meet you at the market later. Kofi gave him a wary look but nodded. Be careful, Eo. This feels dangerous. Eo knew Kofi was right. Whatever was happening in the city was bigger than just the whispers he'd been hearing. Dark forces were awakening, and somehow, he was tied to them. Babatan's house felt even more foreboding as Eo approached it, the thick baobab trees casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Eo hesitated at the door, knowing that whatever answers he sought would not come easily, or without consequence. When Babatan opened the door, his face was solemn. You felt it, haven't you? He asked, his eyes narrowing. The power within you. The gods have begun their work. Eo stepped inside, his mouth dry. I don't want this power. I don't even know what it is. Babatan motioned for him to sit. The forgotten gods chose you because you have something they need. You are a vessel, Eo, a bridge between their world and ours. And now, they are using that bridge to cross over. Eo's stomach tightened with fear. But why me? Why now? The old man sighed, leaning on his walking stick. There is a prophecy. A child of the city, marked by the gods, would come when the world has forgotten them. You are that child, Eo. The gods seek to reclaim their dominion through you. Eo's hands trembled as he looked down at the glowing mark on his skin. It felt like a curse. But I never asked for this. How do I stop them? Babatan's eyes grew dark. You can't stop them, Eo. The gods' will is not something you can deny. But there may be a way to control the power they've given you, to channel it, rather than be consumed by it. Eo listened intently, the weight of the prophecy sinking in. He wasn't just marked, he was part of something ancient, something bigger than he had ever imagined. But if he could control the power, maybe he could protect the city, protect the people he cared about. How? Eo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There are rituals, Babatan said gravely. Dark rituals. But they come with great risk. The power you will summon could either save you or destroy you. Determined to take control of his fate, Eo agreed to undergo the ritual that Babatan spoke of. He knew that the risks were great, but the alternative, allowing the gods to use him as a pawn, was far worse. That night, Babatan led Eo deep into the forest outside Ngola, to a place where the ancient gods were once worshipped. The air was thick with the scent of earth and leaves, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, weathered and covered in moss. Babatan began to draw symbols in the dirt around the altar, chanting softly in the old tongue. Eo felt a chill run down his spine as the shadows around them seemed to thicken, as if watching. The ritual will test your spirit, Babatan said, his voice low and steady. You must face the darkness within you. Only then will you gain control over the power that binds you to the gods. Eo swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew there was no turning back now. As Babatan continued his chant, Eo stepped up to the altar and placed his hand on the cold stone surface. Immediately, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, and the world around him went dark. Eo found himself standing in a vast, empty space, no sky, no ground, just an endless void. In the distance, he saw a figure moving toward him, its form shifting and changing. It was him. Or rather, the twisted version of him, darker, more sinister. The figure grinned, and Eo's heart raced as he realized what he was facing, his own fear, his own darkness. The figure lunged at him, its hands outstretched, and Eo braced himself for impact. The battle for control had begun. Eo's pulse quickened as the dark figure charged toward him. It moved like a shadow, twisting and warping, its face a grotesque version of his own, with hollow eyes and a wicked grin. This was no ordinary enemy, it was the embodiment of his darkest fears, everything he had tried to bury inside. Instinctively, Eo raised his hands in defense, but the figure was too fast. It slammed into him, knocking him to the ground with a force that stole the breath from his lungs. He struggled to push it off, but it was like wrestling with smoke, slippery and intangible. You can't escape me, Eo, the figure hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. I am everything you fear. I am the doubt that gnaws at you, the weakness you hide. You'll never be rid of me. Eo's heart pounded in his chest. He had never faced anything like this before. Every time he tried to stand, the figure pushed him down, overpowering him. It was as if his own fears were dragging him into the abyss. But then, in the depths of his mind, Eo remembered something Babatan had told him, you must face the darkness within you. Only then will you gain control. Eo closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He needed to confront this thing, not fight it. This wasn't a battle of strength, it was a test of his will. Slowly, he rose to his feet, standing firm in front of the shadow. I'm not afraid of you, Eo said, his voice trembling but resolute. You're a part of me, but you don't control me. The figure's grin faltered for a moment, and in that instant, Eo felt a shift. The shadow recoiled, no longer looming as large as before. It was still there, still menacing, but its power was diminishing. Eo could feel it. He took a step forward, his confidence growing. I accept you. I accept my fears, my doubts, and my weaknesses. But you won't define me. The figure shrank, its form flickering and losing shape. Eo could sense its power fading as he embraced his own strength. Finally, with a final burst of determination, he reached out and touched the shadow, and it dissolved into nothingness. The darkness around him lifted, and Eo found himself back in the forest, standing before the stone altar. Babatan stood nearby, watching with a knowing look in his eyes. You passed the first trial, Babatan said softly. But this is only the beginning. The gods are watching, and they will not make it easy for you. Eo's hand still pulsed with the faint glow of the mark, but he felt different now. Stronger. He had faced his own darkness and survived. But he knew that there were more challenges ahead, and the gods' intentions remained unclear. The days that followed were filled with unease. Eo could feel the power within him growing, but with it came a constant sense of dread. He could sense the presence of the gods more clearly now, whispers in the wind, shadows that seemed to move on their own. They were watching him, waiting for the next step in their plan. One evening, as Eo sat alone in his small apartment, there was a sudden knock at the door. His heart jumped, and he hesitated before opening it. Standing on the other side was a woman he had never seen before. She was tall, with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Her hair was braided into intricate patterns, and she wore a long robe that shimmered like the night sky. "I've been sent by the gods," the woman said in a calm, almost musical voice. "My name is Adisa." Eo stepped back, unsure of how to respond. "Sent by the gods? Why?" Adisa smiled faintly. "The gods have plans for you, Eo. They've been watching you closely, and now they wish to speak." Eo's mind raced. He had known the gods were watching him, but he hadn't expected them to send someone directly to him. "What do they want?" Adisa's eyes softened. "They want to guide you. You've been chosen, Eo, to be their messenger in this world. But there are forces working against you, forces that would see the gods remain forgotten and their power extinguished." Eo's stomach tightened. "Forces? You mean the cult?" Adisa nodded. "Yes, the cult seeks to keep the gods buried in the past, to ensure that their influence never rises again. But with your help, the gods can reclaim their place in this world. You must prepare yourself for the coming battle." Eo's thoughts spun. This was all happening too fast. He had only just begun to understand his connection to the gods, and now he was being thrust into a conflict that seemed far beyond his control. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Adisa stepped forward, placing a hand on Eo's shoulder. "The gods will guide you. But you must trust in them and in yourself. The power within you is only beginning to awaken. In time, you will understand." Eo felt a strange warmth radiating from her touch, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't as powerless as he had thought. But even as Adisa spoke, Eo knew that the path ahead would be dangerous. The cult, the gods, the dark forces stirring in the shadows, he was caught in the middle of something ancient and powerful. And he wasn't sure if he was ready. The following night, Eo received another visitor, but this time, it was not a friendly one. He was walking home from the market when he noticed a group of figures trailing behind him. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but as he quickened his pace, so did they. By the time he reached his street, his heart was pounding in his chest. Just as he was about to reach his apartment, one of the figures stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The man wore a long, dark robe, and his face was partially hidden beneath a hood. "You've been marked by the gods," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "But you do not understand the danger you're in. The gods cannot protect you from what's coming." Eo's pulse quickened. He glanced around, but the street was empty, and the other figures had closed in behind him, cutting off any chance of escape. "What do you want?" Eo asked, his voice trembling. The man chuckled softly. "We are the keepers of the old ways. The gods you serve are relics of a forgotten past. Their time is over, and we will make sure they never rise again." Eo clenched his fists, the mark on his hand tingling with energy. "I don't want any trouble." The man stepped closer, his breath hot against Eo's skin. "It's too late for that. You've already chosen your path. But know this, the gods you serve will betray you. They always do. Before Eo could respond, the man raised his hand, and a sharp pain shot through Eo's head. He stumbled back, his vision blurring, and the last thing he saw was the man's cold smile before everything went black. Eo's eyes fluttered open, his head pounding. He found himself in a dimly lit room with stone walls, cold and damp. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a strange mix of earth and smoke. Chains rattled softly in the distance, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was still dreaming or if this was some twisted reality. He tried to move, but his arms were bound by thick ropes to a wooden chair. Panic surged through him as he tugged at the restraints, but they held firm. His mind raced, trying to piece together how he had ended up here. The last thing he remembered was the cultist's chilling smile before everything had gone dark. The door creaked open, and Eo tensed. A figure stepped into the room, bathed in shadow. It was the same man who had confronted him in the street, his hood still covering half of his face, but now Eo could see his cold, piercing eyes more clearly. "Welcome, Eo," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "You have become a problem. The gods may have chosen you, but their influence is fading. And we, the cult of shadows, will ensure they remain forgotten." Eo glared at him, trying to mask his fear. "What do you want with me? I don't even fully understand what's happening." The man chuckled softly, circling Eo like a predator stalking its prey. "Of course you don't. You're just a pawn in their game, a vessel for their power. But they're using you, Eo. The gods don't care about you, they care about reclaiming the world they lost." Eo swallowed hard, refusing to let the man's words shake him. "I don't believe you. The gods chose me for a reason, and I'll fight for them." The man stopped in front of him, leaning in close so that Eo could feel his breath on his face. "You will fight, yes. But you will lose. You see, the gods demand loyalty, but they are as cruel as they are powerful. They feed on fear, on darkness, on sacrifice. And when they are done with you, they will discard you without a second thought." Eo's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let doubt creep in. "I don't trust you," he spat. "You and your cult are the ones who want to keep people in the dark. The gods want to help us remember who we really are." The man smirked. "Is that what they told you? Oh, Eo, you are more naive than I thought. But no matter. You will soon learn the truth." With that, the man turned and gestured to someone outside the room. Two more cultists appeared, dragging a large stone basin filled with a thick, dark liquid. They placed it in front of Eo, and the scent of it made his stomach churn. It smelled like death, old and musty, like something that had been buried for centuries. The cult leader turned back to Eo, his eyes gleaming with malice. "This is the blood of the forgotten. It is the essence of the gods who were cast aside, those whose names were lost to time. You will drink it, and through it, you will see the truth." Eo recoiled in horror. "I'm not drinking anything." But the cult leader's smile only widened. "Oh, but you will. You see, Eo, this is not a choice. This is destiny." The two cultists grabbed Eo's head, forcing his mouth open. He struggled, kicking and twisting, but they were too strong. They poured the thick, black liquid into his mouth, and the taste of it burned his throat, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. As the liquid seeped into his body, Eo's vision blurred again, but this time, it wasn't darkness that greeted him. Instead, he found himself standing in a vast, empty void, a place where time seemed to stand still. The sky was an endless black, and the ground beneath him felt like it was made of shadows. And then, out of the darkness, figures began to emerge. They were twisted, distorted versions of gods he had only heard of in ancient stories, creatures of immense power who had been forgotten by the world. Their forms were monstrous, their eyes glowing with hatred and sorrow. They loomed over Eo, their voices echoing in his mind. We were once worshipped, Eo. We were once powerful. But now, we are nothing. Forgotten. Lost. Eo's heart raced as the gods closed in around him. He wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Their voices became louder and more insistent, as if they were trying to tear him apart from the inside. You will bring us back, Eo. You will help us reclaim what was taken from us. And in return, we will give you power beyond your wildest dreams. Eo shook his head, his body trembling. No. I won't be your puppet. I won't. But the gods only laughed, a sound that echoed like thunder in the void. You have no choice, Eo. You are already bound to us. You drank the blood. Now, you belong to us. Eo's vision began to spin, and he felt himself falling deeper and deeper into the darkness. The gods' laughter echoed in his ears, and their twisted forms loomed over him, growing larger and more terrifying with every passing moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went black. Eo awoke in his apartment, drenched in sweat. His heart pounded in his chest as the memory of the cult, the blood, and the gods flashed through his mind. But as he sat up, something felt different. His hands glowed faintly with the mark the gods had given him, but it was stronger now, more vivid, pulsing with power. Eo could feel it coursing through his veins, filling him with energy he had never known before. He stood up, his legs shaky but steady enough to carry him to the window. Outside, the city was still, the moon casting an eerie glow over the streets. But Eo knew that something had changed. The gods were closer now, their presence more tangible. And with them came a new sense of purpose. But along with that purpose came fear, fear of what he had become, and fear of what he would have to face next. The streets of the city were eerily quiet as Eo moved through the alleys and narrow pathways, the weight of his newfound power making his steps heavier than usual. The glow in his hands faded with each passing moment, but the mark remained, a constant reminder of the god's presence within him. He had heard the stories, gods, forgotten and vengeful, living in the shadows of the world, waiting for the right time to rise again. But now, they weren't just stories. They were his reality. As Eo walked, the air grew thick, almost oppressive. The city, once bustling with life, seemed to have fallen into a strange slumber, as though the gods themselves were watching from the shadows, waiting for something. He had to find answers, and fast. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the soft footsteps behind him. Eo turned, his heart racing, to find a woman standing in the street, her face obscured by a dark veil. She was tall, her posture regal, with an aura of power that sent a shiver down Eo's spine. You've been chosen, the woman said in a voice that was both soothing and commanding. But the gods are not the only ones watching you. Eo squinted, trying to make sense of her words. Who are you? He demanded, his voice shaky but strong. I am Olwyn, she said, stepping closer. A servant of the gods, yes, but one who understands what they want and what they are capable of. Eo's breath caught in his throat. You know about the blood? The gods. Olwyn nodded solemnly. I know far more than you think. I've watched the rise and fall of the gods for centuries. I know their hunger for power, their need to be worshipped. But I also know the price of their return. Eo swallowed hard. What price? She stepped closer, lowering her veil. Her eyes were cold, calculating. You may have thought you were chosen for something great, but there are others. There are those who seek to use the gods for their own gain, to manipulate their power for greed and revenge. And they will stop at nothing. Eo's mind raced. He had thought the gods had chosen him to bring them back, to restore their lost power. But now he wasn't so sure. How do you know all this? I've seen it, she replied simply. The gods' influence is vast. They whisper in the ears of men and women across the world. They twist their desires, lead them to darkness, and in the end, they feed on their fear. But you, she pointed at Eo, her voice growing sharp. You are different. You were chosen by them, yes, but you also have the power to stop them. Eo blinked in confusion. Stop them? How can I stop them when they've already marked me? Olwyn smiled grimly. It's not too late. You must find the other chosen ones, those like you, who have felt the gods' power but have resisted it. Together, you can break their hold. But be careful, Eo. The gods are powerful, and they do not take kindly to defiance. Eo's head swam with the enormity of what Olwen was saying. He had thought his path was clear, he was a servant of the gods, the vessel for their power. But now there was doubt. And doubt was dangerous. Where do I find them? Eo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The ones you seek are not far. They are watching you, waiting for the right moment. But you must be careful, there are enemies among them, and some have already fallen under the gods' control. Eo looked at her, uncertainty swelling in his chest. What do you want from me? Olwen smiled, but it was a cold, hollow smile. I want you to succeed, Eo. I want you to remember that power is not always the answer. And that not all who serve the gods are their allies. With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Eo standing alone in the street, his mind reeling. The weight of the gods' power still pulsed within him, but now, the path ahead was clouded with fear and uncertainty. Who could he trust? And more importantly, who was really in control, the gods, or those who had their own dark plans? Eo spent the next few days in a haze, torn between the gods who had marked him and the cryptic warnings of Olwen. He barely slept, pacing through the nights, feeling the weight of the mark on his skin growing heavier with every passing moment. The gods were patient, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. One evening, as he walked through the city's bustling market, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meat and fresh produce, he felt something strange, a shift in the atmosphere. The crowd moved around him, but he noticed a figure in the distance, standing alone in the center of the market, a woman draped in dark robes. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but there was something unmistakably familiar about her presence. Without thinking, Eo began to push through the crowd, the glow in his hands flickering as if reacting to the energy around him. The woman turned as if sensing his approach. Her eyes, burning red, the color of smoldering coals, are locked onto his. Are you the one they call the chosen? She asked, her voice like ice. The one who dares to stand against the gods. Eo stopped, his heart hammering in his chest. Who are you? The woman's smile was twisted, and Eo could feel the power emanating from her. I am Nia, she said. And I am here to make sure you do not succeed. Before Eo could react, the ground beneath him trembled. The air grew thick with dark energy, swirling around them like a storm ready to explode. You cannot stop what is coming, Nia said, her eyes glowing brighter. The gods will return, and nothing will stand in their way. Eo's hands glowed brighter, the power within him surging in response to Nia's challenge. But deep down, he knew she was right. The gods were coming, and the storm had already begun. Eo's pulse quickened as Nia's dark energy swirled around him. The once bustling market seemed to disappear, replaced by an eerie silence. The wind whispered, carrying with it the scent of ancient, forgotten things. Eo could feel the gods watching, waiting for the storm to reach its peak. Nia's eyes gleamed with malevolence, the red glow a harbinger of the power she wielded. You think you can stop them, Eo, she sneered. You are nothing but a puppet. The gods have already chosen their champions. And you are merely a tool in their game. Eo clenched his fists, the dark power within him crackling. I'm not a tool. I'm not a puppet, he said through gritted teeth. I won't let the gods destroy this city. I won't let them return." The woman's laughter echoed in the empty market, a cruel sound that made Eo's blood run cold. "You think you can resist them? You, who bear their mark?" She gestured at his hands, glowing faintly in the dim light. "That mark is a beacon for them, Eo. It calls them to this world. They will come, and when they do, nothing will stand in their way." Eo took a step forward, his heart beating loudly in his chest. He could feel the presence of something ancient, something vast, looming just beyond the veil of reality. The gods were closer than ever, their dark influence spreading like a poison through the city. "I will not be their servant," Eo said, his voice steady. "I will fight back. I will find the others. I will make sure that they don't take over." Nia's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "You fool. You cannot fight the gods. You can't even begin to understand their power." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook violently. The buildings around them groaned, and the sky above darkened as if the clouds themselves were drawn to the conflict. A wave of dark energy surged through the air, and Eo felt a sharp pain in his chest. He staggered, his vision blurring as the power inside him fought against Nia's influence. Nia took a step closer, her voice low and dangerous. "You are not ready, Eo. You think you can protect this city, but you are merely a pawn in their plan. There is a greater force at work here. The gods are not interested in the mortal world. They care only for their return to power." Eo fell to his knees, the pain intensifying. He could feel the gods reaching out to him, their presence like a dark cloud pressing in from all sides. The power within him was real, but it was also out of his control, swirling around him in a chaotic storm. For a moment, he felt as though he might lose himself to it. But then, through the haze of pain and fear, the flicker of clarity appeared in his mind. Olwen's words echoed in his head, "You have the power to stop them." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on that single truth. The gods might have chosen him, but that didn't mean he was bound to their will. He had the strength to resist. Eo stood slowly, summoning every ounce of willpower he had left. The mark on his hands burned, but this time he let it. He embraced the power within him, not as a servant, but as a force to be reckoned with. Nia's expression faltered, her eyes widening with uncertainty. "You resist," she whispered. "But you cannot win." Eo's voice was quiet but firm. "We'll see about that." In a flash, the air around them shifted. The storm that had been building for what felt like an eternity now seemed to crackle with energy. But instead of the darkness consuming him, Eo felt a surge of light, fierce, wild, and untamed, coursing through his veins. He raised his hand, and the power within him responded, a glowing barrier of energy forming around him, pushing Nia's influence back. The woman's smile vanished as she took a step back, her dark power faltering in the face of Eo's newfound strength. "This isn't over, Eo," she hissed, her voice sharp as a blade. "The gods will come. And when they do, you won't be able to stop them." Eo's voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that sent a shiver down her spine. "I'll be ready." Nia's form flickered, and in a blink, she was gone, vanished into the darkness from which she had emerged. Eo stood alone in the quiet market once again, the power still humming in his chest, but now he had a sense of control. For the first time since he had discovered the mark, he felt like he might be able to make a difference. But as he looked up at the dark sky, the threat of the gods loomed larger than ever. The city was still under their watchful gaze. And Eo knew that the real battle was only just beginning. Days passed, and the city remained tense, the air thick with a strange energy. Eo's senses were heightened, every shadow seeming like a potential threat, every whisper in the wind carrying the weight of unseen eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that the gods were getting closer, that their influence was seeping into the very heart of the city. It was late one evening when Eo received a message from a stranger. The note was simple, come to the old library. We need to talk." No name, no signature, just those words scrawled in an almost hurried script. Eo hesitated at first, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. He needed answers, and this might be his only chance to get them. The library was on the outskirts of the city, hidden away in a quiet corner where the streets were darker and the air felt colder. Eo approached cautiously, glancing over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't being followed. When he reached the library's entrance, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been expecting him. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of old books and forgotten knowledge hanging heavy in the air. Eo stepped lightly, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty space. In the far corner, an old man sat at a table, his back turned to Eo. The man was hunched over, reading something in a language Eo couldn't quite understand. "You're late," the man said without turning around. Eo stepped closer, wary. "Who are you?" The man finally looked up, his eyes sharp and knowing. "I'm someone who knows the truth. The truth about the gods and the power that they seek. And I know why you've been chosen." Eo swallowed hard. "I don't know why I've been chosen. But I intend to find out." The old man smiled, his face creased with age and wisdom. "The gods have their champions, but they are not the only ones who fight for control. There are others, secret keepers like myself, who guard the old knowledge. The knowledge that can stop them." Eo listened closely, his heart racing. "What do you know?" The old man leaned forward, his voice low. "I know that the gods are not just ancient beings. They are living forces, tied to the belief of the people. And their power grows stronger with every prayer, every offering, every act of worship." Eo's stomach tightened. "But if they are tied to belief, they are only as strong as the belief they feed on," the old man finished. "But there are those who can resist their pull. You, Eo, are one of those. And together with the others, you may have a chance to stop them." Eo looked at the old man, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So, I'm not the only one, am I? There are others like me?" The old man nodded. "Yes. But finding them will not be easy. And there are forces working against you." Eo clenched his fists, determination flaring within him. "I'll find them. And I'll stop the gods." The old man's eyes gleamed with a knowing look. "Be careful, Eo. The gods are watching. And you are not alone." The old man's words echoed in Eo's mind as he stepped out of the library into the cool night air. The city was quieter than usual, the streets still and empty, as though the entire place held its breath. The weight of the god's presence pressed down on him like a heavy cloak. He was no longer just a man caught in the flow of life. Now, he was a part of something far greater and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Eo had learned that the gods were not merely ancient figures from stories. They were forces, powerful, terrifying, and living on in the belief of those who still worshipped them. If he wanted to stop them, he would need allies, those who had been chosen like he was, those who held the knowledge and strength to fight back. But the old man's warning still lingered in his mind, "Be careful, Eo. The gods are watching. And you are not alone." Eo had no idea who or what the other force might be, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to find the others like him. They would need to band together, to resist the gods and their dark power. As he made his way through the winding streets, a chill ran down his spine. Something felt off. The city had always been alive with noise and movement, but tonight, it felt as though the walls themselves were watching him. He heard footsteps behind him, quick and quiet, but when he turned, no one was there. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind. The god's influence was already beginning to wear on him. He paused at a street corner, looking around. His instincts told him to be on high alert, but there was no immediate danger. Then, From a shadowy alleyway ahead, a figure emerged. It was a woman, draped in a dark cloak that seemed to absorb the light around her. Eo's heart quickened as she drew closer. The woman was tall and slender, her face hidden beneath the hood, but her eyes gleamed in the dim light. There was something about her, something both familiar and unsettling. "Are you Eo?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Eo tensed, unsure whether to trust her. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman stepped into the light, revealing her face. Her skin was a rich, dark brown, and her eyes were sharp and piercing, as though she could see through him. "I'm someone who's been watching you," she said. "You've been chosen, just as I have. We are part of something much bigger, Eo." Eo frowned. "What do you mean?" She pulled back the hood, revealing long, braided hair adorned with beads and charms that clinked softly as she moved. "My name is Imani. I've been waiting for you. The gods are coming, Eo, and we need to act quickly." Eo narrowed his eyes. "You know about the gods?" Imani nodded. "I know more than you can imagine. They've been watching us for centuries. But now they're coming back, stronger than ever. The city is a key, Eo. They need it to open the gateway to the world they left behind." Eo's heart skipped a beat. He remembered the old man's words about the gods feeding on belief. Could it be that the city itself was the key to their return? Could their influence already be rooted in the very ground beneath his feet? "I don't know how to stop them," Eo admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I only know that I have to." Imani stepped closer, her gaze intense. "You're not alone in this. There are others like us, chosen by the gods to either serve them or fight against them. I can introduce you to them. Together, we can find a way to stop the gods from coming." Eo hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could he really trust this stranger? Could he afford to? Imani seemed to sense his hesitation. "The gods are already searching for you, Eo. You can't run from this. You either stand with us, or you fall alone." Eo felt the truth in her words. He couldn't face this battle alone. He needed allies, people who understood the gods' dark magic and the rituals that bound them. "Okay," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll go with you." Imani gave him a small, knowing smile. "Good. But first, we need to meet someone. Someone who knows the ancient rituals. They can help us figure out how to stop the gods before it's too late." Eo nodded. "Where do we go?" Imani glanced around, her eyes flickering with a hint of something darker, something ancient. "Follow me." Imani led Eo through narrow alleys, their footsteps silent in the night. The city was dark, but there was something different about the night air. It felt thicker, heavier, almost as if the gods themselves were watching. They arrived at an old, decrepit building, its walls crumbling and covered in vines. It looked abandoned, but Eo could feel a strange energy radiating from within. This was no ordinary place. Imani pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the two of them stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a few flickering candles scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and incense. At the center of the room sat an old woman, her face wrinkled with age but her eyes sharp and alert. She wore an elaborate necklace of bones and beads, her hands adorned with ancient rings. There was something powerful about her, something otherworldly. Imani bowed slightly to the woman. "Mother Nia, this is Eo. He's one of us." Mother Nia's eyes flicked over to Eo, her gaze intense. "I know him," she said in a voice as raspy as wind through dry leaves. "The gods have chosen him, just as they have chosen you, Imani. But he doesn't understand the full weight of their power yet." Eo felt his stomach tighten at the mention of the gods. "What do we do now?" Mother Nia smiled, her ancient eyes gleaming with knowledge. Now, we prepare. She gestured for Eo to sit, and as he did, she began to chant softly, her voice like a low hum. The air grew heavy, the room filled with a sense of anticipation. The gods are awakening, Mother Nia said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there are ways to stop them. Rituals, ancient magic, things that have been hidden for centuries. You will need to learn them if you are to stand a chance. Eo felt a surge of fear mixed with determination. The battle was far from over. The gods were coming, but now, for the first time, he felt like he had a chance to stop them. Mother Nia's chant echoed in the dim room, the words flowing like a hidden river through the air. The walls seemed to hum in response, as if they were alive with the ancient energy she was calling forth. Eo sat in silence, his body tense, his mind racing. The god's power was undeniable, but for the first time since the old man's warning, Eo felt a glimmer of hope. Imani sat beside him, her expression unreadable. The flicker of the candlelight danced over her face, casting deep shadows that made her features appear even more enigmatic. Eo wanted to ask more questions, but he felt the weight of the moment. The air in the room was thick with expectation, and Mother Nia's presence filled every corner of the space. Do you feel it? Mother Nia's voice broke the silence. She looked directly at Eo, her eyes sharp and probing. The power in this place. Eo nodded slowly. It's like the walls are watching us. Like something's waiting. Exactly, Mother Nia whispered. The gods are waiting. Their presence lingers in every stone, every shadow of this city. They've been here, hidden, for centuries. And now, they want to return. Imani leaned forward. We need to know their rituals, Eo. We need to understand their ancient language, how they feed off belief. That's how they're able to keep their power hidden, how they can return. Eo felt a chill run down his spine. It was one thing to know the gods were powerful, but another to understand that they could manipulate belief itself. He glanced at the old woman. What do we do now? Mother Nia reached for a wooden box on the floor beside her. It was old, covered in dust, and carved with strange symbols Eo didn't recognize. She opened it carefully, revealing an ancient book, its pages yellowed and fragile. The cover was made of dark leather, embossed with strange markings. The Book of Shadows. This, Mother Nia said softly, is the key. It holds the knowledge of the gods' ancient rituals. The ones they used to walk the earth freely. The ones they will use again to take control of this world. Eo's hands shook as he reached out to touch the book. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, a strange jolt of energy passed through him. His heart raced, and the world seemed to shift around him, the room growing darker, the air heavier. The book is alive, Mother Nia said, her voice barely a whisper. It recognizes you, Eo. You're tied to it now. The gods know you found it. Imani's eyes widened. It's dangerous to open it without protection. The book holds ancient magic, dark magic. You must be careful. Eo nodded, swallowing hard. He felt the pull of the book's power, but there was no turning back now. This was the path he had chosen. Mother Nia stood and walked toward an altar at the far end of the room. It was carved with intricate symbols, all representing gods and spirits from times long past. She raised her hands and began to chant again, her voice filling the room with an eerie resonance. Eo watched her, his body tense, his heart beating faster. This was no ordinary book, it was a vessel of power, a direct link to the ancient gods. As Mother Nia continued chanting, the air around him began to shift, the room becoming colder, the shadows deepening. Imani spoke in a low voice. The book holds more than just knowledge. It holds the essence of the gods themselves. When you open it, you'll be stepping into their world. You need to be prepared for what you might find. Eo nodded, though his stomach twisted with fear. He had no choice. He opened the book slowly, feeling the weight of its power in his hands. The pages were covered in symbols and ancient text, written in a language that felt both familiar and foreign. The moment the book opened, the room seemed to pulse with energy. Shadows on the walls shifted, forming shapes that danced in the flickering candlelight. The air grew heavy, thick with the presence of something dark and ancient. Eo felt a sharp pull in his chest. It was as though the book was calling to him, drawing him deeper into its mysteries. The symbols on the pages seemed to glow faintly, and as he looked closer, he realized they were moving, shifting, rearranging themselves, as though the book was alive, breathing. Imani stepped forward, her face pale. "Close the book, Eo. It's too dangerous." But Eo couldn't move. He was transfixed by the symbols, by the energy swirling around him. He could hear whispers in his mind, low, insistent, almost pleading. The gods were speaking to him. "Do not fear the darkness," a voice whispered in his ear. "Embrace it, and you will understand the power you hold. You are one of us now." Eo's heart raced. The voice was powerful, commanding. It spoke with authority, but also with a strange sort of familiarity. Imani grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the book. "It's calling to you, Eo. The gods want you. But we need to shut it down before it takes you completely." With a trembling hand, Eo slammed the book shut. The room fell silent, the shadows retreating as the energy dispersed. His heart pounded in his chest, and he looked at the others, their faces filled with concern. Mother Nya let out a long, slow breath. "The gods know you now, Eo. They will come for you." Eo swallowed hard, the fear crawling back into his gut. "What do we do next?" Imani placed a hand on his shoulder. "Next, we prepare. We can't let them take this city. We can't let them open the gateway." But Eo knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The gods were watching, and they would not stop until they had what they wanted. Eo awoke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. His dreams had been restless, filled with visions of dark shadows that crept through the city streets, whispering his name. The air had felt heavy, suffocating, and his mind was still racing from the events of the night before. He sat up in bed, trying to shake off the lingering fear. The Book of Shadows still lay on the small table across the room, closed but ominously present. He hadn't been able to take his eyes off it since the moment it had been revealed. The weight of the gods' power was undeniable. They were watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. Eo rubbed his face, his mind reeling. He could hear faint whispers, too soft to make out, but they were there, lurking in the corners of his thoughts. The gods, or whatever ancient power resided in that book, had touched him, and now they were in his mind. He could feel it. It was like a dark presence, like a shadow that had latched onto his soul. He glanced at the window. It was still early, and the city was just starting to wake up. But something felt off. The streets seemed quieter than usual, almost empty. A strange stillness hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. Eo heard a knock at his door. He hesitated, heart pounding. Who could it be at this time? Slowly, he walked to the door, peeking through the small gap to see Imani standing outside, her face pale and eyes wide with worry. "Eo," she whispered urgently, "we need to talk. Now." He opened the door, and she stepped inside quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her. "It's happening, Eo," she said breathlessly. "The city, the gods, they're waking up. I don't know how much longer we have." Eo felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean, waking up?" Imani's voice was tight with fear. "The Book of Shadows, it's not just a book. It's a doorway. A gateway. Every time you open it, you bring them closer. You felt it last night, didn't you? The whispers, the shadows. They are not just dreams, Eo. They are real. He nodded, swallowing hard. He had felt it, the pull, the sensation of something ancient stirring within the city. It was like the earth itself was trembling, as if the gods were rising from the ground. They know you're connected to the book, Imani continued, her voice barely above a whisper. They've seen you. They know you've opened the gateway, and now they are watching you more closely. They won't stop until they're free. Eo's mind raced. The city was already changing, he could feel it in the air, in the people around him. There was a tension, an undercurrent of fear. He couldn't explain it, but it was as though something was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to break through. They are manipulating the city's energy, Imani said. The buildings, the streets, they've always been a part of the gods' domain, but they've been hidden, locked away by time. Now, the gods are using the energy in the air, the power of belief, to break free. The rituals you've learned, they are meant to give them a physical presence. A way to control the world. Eo felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just part of a story anymore. The gods were real. The darkness was real. And the city itself was beginning to transform, to shift into something darker. I need to find a way to stop them, Eo said, determination growing in his chest. Imani nodded. But it won't be easy. You have to understand, this is not just about the gods. It's about the people too. Their beliefs, their fears, their rituals, they all feed the gods. We have to break that cycle. We need to find the source, the place where the gods have been hidden for all these years. Only then can we close the gateway for good. Eo looked down at the Book of Shadows, its cover still closed but pulsing with energy. It had given him power, but now it seemed more like a curse. The gods were waking up, and he was their key. We need to get to the heart of it, Eo said, a fierce resolve in his voice. We need to find where the gods are hiding and destroy the gateway before they can fully awaken. Imani nodded, but there was a look of uncertainty in her eyes. It's not going to be that simple, Eo. The gods, they have agents. People who worship them, who carry out their will. They won't let us get close without a fight. Eo clenched his fists. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He'd faced fear and darkness before, but this was something different. These were gods. They were older than time, and their power was beyond anything he could have imagined. I know, Eo said, his voice low. But I don't care what it takes. We end this. Now. Imani gave him a hard look, as if weighing his words. Then, without another word, she turned and left the room. Eo stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, his heart racing. The gods were out there, and they were coming for him. But he wasn't going to run. He had a city to protect, and a war to fight. Eo spent the next few days in a haze, consumed by the knowledge that the gods were getting closer. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The city, once bustling and full of life, now seemed on edge. People moved hurriedly, avoiding eye contact, whispering in fear of something they couldn't name. But Eo knew the truth, the gods were rising, and they were using the city as their playground. He sat alone in his apartment, staring at the Book of Shadows. It sat there, innocent looking, but Eo knew better. Each time he touched it, the whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper. He had to stop this, but he had no idea how. Imani had come by the previous evening with a plan. She'd found something, an ancient shrine hidden beneath the city, a place where the gods were said to have once been worshipped. A place where their power had been sealed away. It was their last hope. The shrine is hidden, Imani had said, her voice tense. It was lost for centuries, but the rituals in the Book of Shadows, they can lead us there. If we can find the shrine and destroy the altar, we might be able to close the gateway for good. Eo had nodded. He felt a sense of urgency that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore, he was fighting for the future of the city. The future of everyone he loved. The next morning, he met Imani at the edge of the city. The air was thick with tension, as if the very ground beneath their feet was waiting to explode. Together, they walked through narrow alleyways and darkened streets. Eo could feel it now, the city itself seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, a dark force gathering around them. After hours of searching, they arrived at a seemingly ordinary building, tucked away in a forgotten part of the city. It was an old, crumbling structure, the walls covered in vines, the windows shattered and dark. No one paid it any attention, but Eo could feel the power radiating from it. This was the place. Are you sure this is it? Eo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Imani nodded, her expression tense. She held the Book of Shadows in her hands, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. The shrine should be beneath this building. We just have to find the entrance. Together, they moved toward the back of the building, where the ground was uneven and cracked. After searching for what felt like hours, Eo spotted something strange, the small, weathered stone that seemed to shift when he touched it. With a forceful push, the stone moved, revealing a dark hole beneath the earth. Here, Imani said, her voice low but urgent. We go down. Eo hesitated for a moment before stepping into the darkness. The air around him was cold, and the ground beneath his feet felt unstable. But he couldn't back out now. Not with the gods so close. They climbed down into the subterranean shrine, a place that felt ancient and forgotten. The walls were covered in symbols, faint and worn from centuries of age. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, but Eo could feel the power here, the same power that had been in the Book of Shadows, the same power that had been awakening. In the center of the shrine stood an altar. It was massive, made of stone, covered in strange markings that glowed faintly in the darkness. Eo could feel the gods' presence here, their eyes watching, waiting. Imani stepped forward, her voice steady. This is it. The altar. If we destroy it, the gods will lose their hold on the city. The gateway will close. Eo took a deep breath. The air here was heavier than ever, as though the gods were pressing in on them from all sides. He felt a sudden coldness, the chill that went straight to his bones. The shadows around the altar seemed to shift, as if they were alive, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. They are here, Imani whispered, her voice shaking. The gods know we are here. Eo turned to her, his eyes sharp. We need to hurry. Imani nodded, her hands trembling as she opened the Book of Shadows. She began to chant, her voice low and rhythmic. The words echoed through the shrine, filling the air with a sense of power. The symbols on the altar began to glow, the stone trembling under the force of the ritual. But then, something went wrong. The altar's glow intensified, and Eo felt a sharp pain in his chest. It was as if something was pulling at him, tugging at his very soul. The shadows around them grew longer, darker, swirling like a storm about to break. No! Eo shouted, clutching his chest as the pain worsened. It's too strong. Imani's chanting faltered, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain control. The Book of Shadows slipped from her grasp and fell to the ground, its pages fluttering open. The shadows in the room shifted, becoming more aggressive, as if the gods themselves were rising from the depths of the earth. We have to finish this. Eo shouted, his voice strained. Imani, keep going. But the shadows were relentless. They swirled around them, growing thicker, and Eo could see shapes moving within them, figures with glowing eyes, their forms twisted and ancient. They were here, and they were angry. Eo knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this darkness consume the city. With every ounce of strength, he stepped forward and reached out toward the altar, his hands shaking. The gods were close now, their power overwhelming, but he wouldn't back down. Not now. With one final push of will, Eo placed his hands on the altar. A surge of energy pulsed through him, and for a moment, he felt as if the very earth itself was shaking. Then, with a burst of light, the shadows screamed and recoiled, retreating into the dark corners of the shrine. The altar shattered. Eo fell to his knees, exhausted. The darkness began to dissipate, and the shrine was silent once more. Imani rushed to his side, her face pale but relieved. "We did it," she whispered, her voice shaking. Eo nodded, but he knew this wasn't over. The gods were still out there, watching, waiting. And as long as the Book of Shadows existed, they would always be a threat. But for now, they had won. Eo woke to a cold sweat, the remnants of the shrine's dark magic still lingering in the air around him. The last few days had been exhausting, his mind swimming with visions of the gods, the shadows they cast, and the blood that had flowed in the shrine. They had been sealed, but not gone. He knew that. Imani was by his side, her face pale but resolute. They had stayed up late the previous night, talking through what had happened, piecing together what they could. But still, the questions remained. Why had the gods been so close to breaking free? Why had they risen now, after all this time? "They won't stop," Imani said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, her expression distant. "The gods are angry, and they won't be silenced forever. We need to finish this." Eo nodded, though the weight of the task before them felt like a mountain on his shoulders. He had felt the gods' power. They were stronger than anything he had ever imagined. But he couldn't allow them to rise fully. The city would burn. "I think I know where we need to go next," Eo said, suddenly feeling a surge of certainty. "There's another place, the last remnant of the old gods. It's deeper, darker. It's hidden, but I saw it in the Book of Shadows." Imani's eyes widened, and she stood up, her body tensing. "Are you sure?" Eo nodded. "It's the only way to keep them from rising. If we don't stop them now, they'll destroy everything." The journey took them through the outskirts of the city, past crumbling buildings and forgotten ruins. No one followed them, and the streets were eerily quiet. There was a weight in the air, a sense that something was watching them. The gods were always watching. After hours of searching, they came to a narrow alleyway, where the walls were covered in ancient symbols. Eo could feel the presence of the old gods here, so ancient, so powerful that it made his skin crawl. This was the place. The entrance to the shrine was hidden in plain sight at a doorway so small and narrow that it would have been easy to miss. But Eo could feel the power emanating from it. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, the walls lined with carvings of ancient rituals and forgotten deities. There was an altar at the center, just like the shrine beneath the city, but this one felt older, darker. Eo could almost hear the whispers of the gods, their voices growing louder as they sensed their arrival. "This is it," Imani whispered. "This is where they sealed away the gods." Eo stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the gods now, their power clawing at the edges of his mind. But he didn't falter. Not this time. Together, they began the ritual, using the Book of Shadows once again. Eo recited the ancient words, his voice shaking at first but growing stronger as the power of the gods fought back. The shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, forming shapes that danced in the corners of the shrine. Then, there was silence. Eo opened his eyes, sweat dripping down his forehead. The gods were gone, for now. But he knew they weren't finished. "They're not done," Eo said, his voice hoarse. "But they'll have to wait." The next day, a storm swept through the city. Dark clouds gathered overhead, blotting out the sun. Eo and Imani could feel the storm was not just a weather event, it was the gods' rage, the sign that they were awakening. Eo's phone buzzed. A message from his old friend, Kofi. "We need to talk," the message said. Eo knew what that meant. Kofi had always been in tune with the strange forces of the city, the hidden magic that many overlooked. If there was anyone who could help them now, it was him. They met Kofi in a small cafe on the edge of the city. He was dressed in black, his face serious, his eyes shadowed with worry. "The gods are awakening," Kofi said, getting straight to the point. "The seal has been broken, and they are moving. They are not just trying to return to the world, they are trying to take it." Imani crossed her arms. "We've done everything we could. We sealed them away in the shrine, but they're still here." Kofi nodded. "The gods are not bound by our rules. They can slip through the cracks, find a way back. There's only one place left where we can stop them for good." Eo's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" Kofi leaned in, his voice low. "The Temple of the Forgotten. It's the place where the gods first came to this world. If we destroy the altar there, we can break their power forever." Eo felt the weight of the decision. The temple was hidden in the heart of the jungle, a place few dared to venture. But if Kofi was right, it was their last chance. "We have to go," Eo said, determination filling his voice. "We can't let them win." The journey to the Temple of the Forgotten was arduous. Eo, Imani, and Kofi traveled for hours, trekking through dense jungle, where the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The path was narrow, the ground uneven, and the sounds of unseen creatures echoed around them. As they walked, Eo couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The jungle itself seemed alive, as though the gods had made it their home. The trees bent and twisted, their roots reaching out like hands, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the temple. It was ancient, the stone weathered and covered in vines, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. But Eo knew this was the place. Imani led the way as they entered the temple, the air growing cooler as they descended into the depths. The walls were covered in strange carvings, depictions of gods, warriors, and rituals that made Eo's skin crawl. "This is it," Kofi said, his voice a whisper. "The altar is somewhere inside. But beware, the gods are not far behind." As they made their way deeper, Eo could feel the energy in the air, heavy and dark. The gods were here, in the very walls of the temple, their whispers growing louder. But Eo pressed on. They had to end this. At last, they found the altar. It was a massive stone slab, covered in ancient symbols, and the air around it crackled with power. "We have to destroy it," Eo said, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Imani stepped forward, her hands trembling as she began to chant from the Book of Shadows. The words felt heavy, and the air grew colder as the gods stirred, their power pushing back. The shadows in the room began to writhe, and Eo felt the pull of the gods as they tried to break free. The air was thick with darkness, and for a moment, Eo thought they might fail. But then, with one final word, the altar cracked. A blinding light filled the room, and the gods screamed in rage as their power was shattered. The darkness retreated, and the jungle around them fell silent. Eo collapsed, exhausted. The gods were gone, for now. But the world had changed. The power of the ancient ones had been broken, but not destroyed. And somewhere, in the shadows, they were still watching. The jungle was still, but the air buzzed with a strange, lingering energy. Eo stood over the shattered altar, his hands still trembling from the ritual. The light had faded, but the sense of unease remained. It wasn't over. Not yet. Imani knelt beside him, wiping the sweat from her brow. "We've done it," she said, her voice quiet. "The gods are sealed. Kofi, standing off to the side, wasn't so sure. Sealed, yes. But not gone. The altar was just a gateway, a crack in the world where they could reach through. Eo nodded, feeling the weight of the truth. It was true, the gods weren't gone. They had been weakened, but the veil between the worlds was still thin. The ancient ones could return whenever they wished. We need to leave, Kofi said, looking around nervously. They might be watching us right now. Imani was already standing, her hand on Eo's shoulder. Let's go. We've done all we can. But as they turned to leave the temple, a sound stopped them in their tracks. A low growl echoing in the distance, followed by the rustling of leaves. Something was moving in the jungle, something fast. They've sent something after us, Kofi whispered. Without hesitation, they began to run, pushing their way through the dense trees. The growling grew louder, closer. Eo could feel his heart pounding, but he didn't dare stop. They had to get out of the jungle. The sound of heavy footsteps behind them made Eo glance over his shoulder. A dark shape was following, moving swiftly between the shadows. It was huge, a creature born of the very darkness that had haunted the temple. It's one of them, Imani gasped. One of the god servants. Kofi pulled out a small charm from his pocket and began chanting under his breath. The creature lunged, but the charm glowed with a bright, blue light. For a moment, the dark creature halted, screeching in pain, before it disappeared into the shadows. We are not safe yet, Kofi said, breathing heavily. The gods are still angry. We need to keep moving. By the time they emerged from the jungle, the storm had fully erupted over the city. The sky was black with swirling clouds, and the wind howled like a beast. Eo, Imani, and Kofi stumbled into the city, the weight of what they had just done heavy on their shoulders. They made their way to a small, hidden place that Kofi knew, a safe house that no one would find unless they knew the way. The storm raged outside, but inside, they were safe. For now. You think they'll stop coming after us? Imani asked, her voice trembling as she sat down on the dusty floor. Eo shook his head. No. The gods are still here. They've just been weakened, but they can still find us if they want. Kofi nodded in agreement. And they will. They are not like anything we've dealt with before. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Eo frowned. But we stopped the ritual. We destroyed their altar. That has to mean something, right? It means we've delayed the inevitable, Kofi said darkly. But unless we find the root of their power, they'll keep coming. The storm outside intensified, but the three of them sat in silence, thinking about what had just happened. The gods were no longer just myths or old stories. They were real. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were angry. I have an idea, Eo said suddenly, his voice low. There's something in the city, the old temples, the ones no one ever talks about. They say they were built to imprison the gods. We need to find them. Imani's eyes widened. But those temples were abandoned long ago. No one knows where they are. I do, Eo said. And I think they're the key to stopping this. Eo led Imani and Kofi through the city's winding streets, heading toward the abandoned part of town where the old temples lay. The air was thick with tension, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. They passed buildings that had long since fallen into ruin, their walls crumbling and overtaken by nature. It felt like walking through a forgotten dream, a place where time had stopped. At last, they came to a narrow alleyway that led to a hidden courtyard. In the center stood a series of ancient stone temples, their carvings worn smooth by centuries of neglect. But Eo knew what he was looking for. These temples were built to hold the gods, he whispered. They were once the places where their power was sealed away. Kofi stepped forward, his hand resting on one of the stone pillars. "This place reeks of old magic," he said, his voice low and tense. "But I can't feel the gods here, at least not yet." Eo approached the central temple, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of vines. He pushed them aside and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with carvings, depictions of gods and rituals, just like in the shrine. "This is where the gods were first locked away," Eo said. "We need to find the key to their prison." Imani was already searching the room, her fingers tracing the symbols on the walls. She stopped suddenly, her hand resting on one of the carvings. "I think I found it," she said. "This symbol, it's the same one from the Book of Shadows. It's the key." Kofi moved in closer. "But how do we use it?" Eo frowned, thinking hard. "We need to perform a ritual just like before. But this time, we can't afford to fail." The three of them gathered in the center of the temple, the key symbol now glowing faintly in the dim light. Eo took the Book of Shadows from his bag, and they began the ritual once again. The air around them grew heavy, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist as they began to chant. The symbols on the walls pulsed with energy, and Eo felt the gods' presence growing stronger, pushing back against their magic. But they pressed on. Imani's voice shook, but her words remained steady as she recited the ancient incantations. Kofi's charm was glowing faintly, providing them with some protection against the gods' wrath. And then there was a flash of light. The walls around them trembled, and the gods' whispers grew louder. "This is it," Eo said through gritted teeth. "We are breaking the seal." Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. A figure stepped into the light, a god, twisted and dark, with eyes like burning coals. But Eo was ready. He reached for the Book of Shadows, his hand steady now, his voice commanding. The ritual was working. Slowly, the figure began to fade, vanishing into the air as the god's power was sealed once again. But the god left behind a final warning, a mark burned into the walls. "They'll be back," Eo said, his voice low. "We haven't seen the last of them." Days passed since the last ritual. Eo, Imani, and Kofi knew the gods were still out there, watching, waiting. The air was thick with tension, and the city seemed quieter than before, almost as if it, too, was holding its breath. But then came the storm. Not a literal one, but a storm of dark energy that swept through the city. People began to act strange, nervous, paranoid. There were whispers of strange occurrences, of animals running wild, strange lights in the sky, and the shadows growing longer at night. Eo knew what this meant. The gods were preparing for their final return. "We need to act fast," Eo said, gathering his friends. "There's one more place we need to go, the hidden vault beneath the city. It's the final resting place of the gods. If we can seal it, we'll be safe." But as they made their way to the vault, the ground shook beneath them. The storm had arrived. Eo, Imani, and Kofi stood before the hidden vault, the final barrier between the gods and the world. The vault was a massive stone structure, covered in ancient runes, glowing faintly in the dim light. "We have to do this," Eo said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Together, they began the final ritual, chanting the words that would seal the gods away for good. But as the power began to surge, a dark shadow moved toward them, the gods' last fury unleashed. The final battle had begun. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the vault's door rumbled and began to crack. Eo, Imani, and Kofi stood united in the center of the ancient stone chamber, their hands shaking from the power they had summoned. The storm outside raged, and within the vault, the very air seemed charged with dark magic. "It's here," Imani whispered, her voice trembling. A shadow began to stretch across the stone walls, dark and twisted, as if the very darkness itself had come alive. From the center of the vault, the godly figure emerged, its form shifting and warping like smoke. Its eyes glowed like burning embers, and its breath was like the coldest wind, freezing the very air around them. Eo's heart raced. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The god was furious, and its power was unlike anything they had ever faced. But they had to hold on. They had to finish the ritual. "I'm ready," Kofi said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the glowing charm, holding it out in front of him. The god's laughter filled the vault, deep and hollow. "You think you can banish me?" it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers in a dark storm. "I am eternal. I was here before the world." The sun rose over the city, casting a soft light over the ruins of the vault. Eo, Imani, and Kofi stood outside, the storm having passed, leaving a calm, eerie quiet in its wake. "We did it," Kofi said quietly, his voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. He looked around the city, sensing that the world had shifted. The gods had been sealed away, for now. But their presence still lingered, like a shadow cast across the land. Imani nodded, though she looked troubled. "The gods are powerful. They won't forget what we've done. They'll find another way to return." Eo gazed at the horizon, his mind still racing. "We've delayed them. But we need to keep watch. We need to be ready." Kofi's hand rested on his shoulder. "And we will be." As the three of them walked back into the city, the world around them felt different. The people seemed unaware of the dark forces that had nearly torn their world apart. The sun shone down on the city, and the streets were calm, but Eo couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The gods were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But for now, they were safe. The battle had been won. But the war had only just begun. Months passed since the battle with the god in the vault, then life in the city had returned to a strange sense of normalcy. But Eo, Imani, and Kofi knew the truth. The gods had not been defeated. They were still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Eo sat alone in the library, the Book of Shadows spread open in front of him. He had been studying it tirelessly, searching for any clue or weakness that could help them. The gods were powerful, but there had to be something, some hidden truth, that could stop them for good. The pages of the book were filled with ancient knowledge, rituals, and forgotten magic. But it was one symbol that kept catching Eo's eye. It was faint, almost invisible, etched into the margins of the page. A small symbol that seemed familiar, yet he couldn't place it. He reached for the page and traced the symbol with his finger. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, and the pages of the book began to glow faintly. Eo's heart raced. He wasn't alone. He turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, bathed in shadow. It was a woman, her face obscured by a dark veil. She stepped forward, her presence commanding and eerie. "You've been searching for answers," the woman said, her voice low and smooth. "But you have only scratched the surface." Eo's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" The woman smiled faintly. "I am one of them. One of the gods you thought you sealed away. But I am not your enemy." Eo's hands clenched in anger. "You're lying. You can't be trusted." The woman's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Trust me, you need my help. If you want to stop the gods for good, you'll have to make a choice. A choice that will change everything." Eo's mind raced. The gods were real. They had been waiting for centuries. And now, the time was coming when they would either rise again or be banished forever. But Eo had a choice to make. The woman's words echoed in Eo's mind. He glanced between her and the Book of Shadows, a heart pounding in his chest. The gods had been sealed away, but they weren't gone. The woman's presence felt like a warning, but also a strange kind of invitation. "What choice?" Eo asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She stepped closer, her dark veil shimmering as if alive, and her eyes gleamed with something ancient and dangerous. The gods are not bound by the laws of this world. They exist beyond time, beyond our understanding. But there's something you can do, Eo. Something you must do, if you want to prevent the coming darkness. Imani and Kofi had been watching from the doorway. They entered quietly, sensing the tension in the air. "What is it?" Imani asked, her voice sharp but calm. Eo glanced at them, his face set with determination. "She says we have to make a choice. A choice that could stop the gods for good." Kofi stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What kind of choice?" The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth sharper than human. "You must decide, keep fighting the gods, or use their power to reshape the world. I can give you the knowledge to do either. But once you choose, there is no going back." Eo felt a chill run down his spine. To fight the gods. To wield their power. Either path would lead them into the heart of darkness. But which one would give them a chance at survival? "I don't trust you," Eo said, taking a step back. The woman laughed, a sound like a snake's hiss. "You don't need to trust me. You just need to understand that your destiny has already been written. You've always been a part of this world, Eo. You've always had the power to choose. The question is whether you will wield it for good or for something darker." Imani looked at Eo, her eyes filled with concern. "We've already lost so much. Are we willing to risk it all?" Kofi clenched his fists. "We can't let them win. We can't let them come back." The woman's gaze shifted to Kofi, then back to Eo. "Then choose, Eo. You cannot delay this any longer. The gods are waiting. The world is waiting." The tension in the room felt unbearable. Eo glanced at his friends, then at the Book of Shadows. The power that lay within it was unimaginable. But was it worth the price? Eo's mind raced as the weight of the woman's words pressed down on him. He could feel the dark magic thrumming in the air, swirling around the chamber like a living thing. "I can give you the knowledge you need," the woman whispered, her voice laced with temptation. "The power to wield the gods' magic. The power to reshape the world in your image. All you have to do is say yes." Kofi stepped forward, his voice firm. "We have to stop them. We can't risk the gods returning. Not after everything we've been through." Imani nodded. "But what if this is a trap? What if the woman is leading us to our doom?" Eo stared at the Book of Shadows. The dark magic it held felt alive, calling to him. He could feel the power thrumming in the air, offering him untold strength. But it wasn't just power, it was danger. The gods had never been fully vanquished. And now, the temptation to use their power to stop them was so strong. "If we use their power," Eo said slowly, "we risk becoming what we've been fighting against. But if we don't, the gods will rise again." The woman smiled, sensing his hesitation. "The gods have always been a part of this world. The only question is whether you will bend the world to your will, or watch it crumble beneath the weight of their power." Eo clenched his fists. The choice was too heavy. And yet, there was a clear path ahead, one that would take them into the heart of the gods' power. "Do it," Kofi said. "We need to make our stand." Eo closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His mind was made up. "I choose to fight," he said, his voice steady. "But we won't use their power. We'll stop them with our own." The woman's expression darkened. "So be it. But know this, the gods will never be truly gone. They will always be waiting, in the shadows, watching. And when they return, you'll have to face them once more." The woman stepped back, vanishing into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. The chamber fell silent, the air heavy with the remnants of dark magic. "We need to seal this place," Eo said, his voice firm. "Before the gods can come back." Imani nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "We need to use the Book of Shadows to complete the ritual. It's the only way to ensure they stay gone." Kofi glanced around, his eyes scanning the chamber. "What about the people outside? The city's still in danger." Eo nodded grimly. "We can't protect everyone. But we can make sure the gods can't reach this world again." With a flick of his hand, the Book of Shadows opened before them. Eo began to chant, his voice strong and clear. The words were ancient, filled with power, but they were also a final plea for the gods to stay away. As the ritual reached its peak, a brilliant light filled the chamber. The ground rumbled, and a sudden gust of wind swept through the vault. The gods were sealed once more, their presence banished from the world for now. The chamber was still, and the three friends stood alone in the silence. Eo, Imani, and Kofi exchanged looks of exhaustion and relief. They had won this battle. But as they stepped out of the vault, they knew the gods' return was only a matter of time. The world was not safe yet. And the shadows would always watch, waiting for the right moment to strike again.